The Industrial Revolution, which took place from the 18th and 19th centuries, rural societies and farming jobs in Europe made up 80% of the workforce. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 1700s, manufacturing was often done in people's homes, using hand tools or basic machines. Industrialization marked a shift in powered special-purpose machinery, factories, and mass production. The textile industry, with the development of the steam engine, played important roles in the Industrial Revolution, which also saw better systems of transportation. While industrialization brought about an improvement on manufacturing of manufactured goods and an improved standard of living, it also resulted in factory owners abusing their workers by making their living accommodations and life in the factory awful. It's impossible to look at the Industrial Revolution and not look at how much it had an impact on the textile industry. The impact of the revolution had on the textile industry cannot be understated. If the revolution never happened, the clothes you'd be wearing right now will be made by your family or bought from your local market. Before factories, textiles were made mainly in people's homes, with merchants often providing the raw materials, and then the people would buy up the finished project. However, this system proved very, very inefficient, and with the basic machinery, not many textiles were made in a day. In the 1700s, a series of innovations led to ever-increasing productivity while requiring less human energy. The innovation of the steam engine that powered new inventions like the power loom revolutionized mass production.
Along with being underfed, the only education they did have was from Sunday school, which taught children skills for factory life and industrial and Christian habits. The rest of their time was spent working in the factories, trying to help their families. In the early 1860s, 1/5 of British textile industry workers were children younger than 15. Those that were too young to work had to raise themselves and younger siblings while their parents and older siblings worked. In the 19th century, 25 to 33% of English children died before the age of 5. Many of the children who worked in factories were orphans. Housing, food, and clothing was offered to children in exchange for their cheap labor. There were also other orphans on the streets who were referred to as street rats and urchins.
On top of the poor home conditions, the conditions of the factory itself were very dangerous. This was also before child labor laws were made and enforced upon children who would often end up in these factories. Workers were often overworked and underpaid because the less owners had to pay them, the more money the owners got. The only light present in the factory came through the windows. Machines spit out smoke, and in some factories, workers came out covered in black soot at the end of the day. There was a plethora of machines with not many safety precautions. This resulted in many accidents. The workers only received a break for lunch and a break for dinner. Children were paid less than 10 cents an hour for 14 hours of work. They were used for simpler, unskilled jobs. Many children had physical deformities because of the lack of exercise.
Along with being underfed, the only education they did have was from Sunday school, which taught children skills for factory life and industrial and Christian habits. The rest of their time was spent working in the factories, trying to help their families. In the early 1860s, 1/5 of British textile industry workers were children younger than 15. Those that were too young to work had to raise themselves and younger siblings while their parents and older siblings worked. In the 19th century, 25 to 33% of English children died before the age of 5. Many of the children who worked in factories were orphans. Housing, food, and clothing was offered to children in exchange for their cheap labor. There were also other orphans on the streets who were referred to as street rats and urchins. Due to the low wages, families could barely afford one apartment, so they had to share the small space with one or more families. The buildings were built close together, usually back to back and side to side in double rows separated by narrow streets, making it difficult to get light or air in the house because of the lack of windows. There was no backyards or outdoor space for children to play and the small amount of free time they had, because on the streets is where solid waste was dumped into piles. There was no running water, and the toilets were shared by the street and emptied by paid night men. The waste on the street led to unsanitary water and diseases such as cholera, which was responsible for 31,000 deaths in 1832. Other diseases included typhoid, smallpox and tuberculosis. Tuberculosis killed 1/3 of the people who died from 1800 to 1850 because of how easily it spread. It infested those in unsanitary living conditions and who were underfed. Being underfed was very common.
Use of children as labor for so long hours with little pay led to the formation of labor unions.